Hello everyone. For this video, we're taking a slight detour away from the general course content, and I just wanted to talk about the final project for a bit. So this information, all but the last slide, applies to everybody in the class, regardless of whether you're doing a group project or an individual project. So typically I review in class after how the project proposal goes with general feedback and then spend a little bit of time in another class discussing logistics for the final project. Because we're remote right now, I wanted to do all of that kind of at once. So I threw together a few slides here, and there will be a quiz following up this. Okay, so just generally, if you have not yet, there are guidelines online for both group and individual submissions. They're within the projects repo in the COGS 108 space. So I know they're long. I encourage you to read through them anyway, just to get a sense of what we're looking for. For those doing the individual project, feel free to put this off until you're about to start doing your analysis. But for the group projects, you should do this now if you have not already. Both the individual and the group projects can use the checklist. And the idea here is you follow all the instructions here. You're about ready to submit. You go through the checklist to make sure you've hit all the points of what we're looking for. Some of these I'm going to discuss today. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of sections in your final report. Your final reports will be submitted as Jupyter notebooks. A lot of these sections overlap with your project proposal. The one thing I wanted to mention is that the permissions is unique to the group projects, and so is team contributions. So those sections are only going to be part of the group submissions. Otherwise, they will look very similar between the group and the individual submissions. The reason there's a permissions in the group project only is because we're asking group projects to specify whether or not they want their group project to be available publicly in the future. So just like you have access to previous quarters, those are all of the projects that had groups who said they wanted it to be made public. This is completely up to you and has no effect on your grade. This is a group decision. If anybody in the group wants it to stay private, please put an X with no here. If everybody's on board with making it available, put an X next to yes. If any groups forget to fill out this section, we will default to no and not make your projects public. So if you're comfortable and want this to be public for future groups to use, click yes. If not, click no, and there is no repercussion on your grade either way. A note that PIDs will be scraped, but your names will be included. So that's an important thing. All right, so beyond talking about permissions, these four highlighted sections are what was part of your project proposal. And I just wanted to encourage you all to use what you did for your project proposal. If it is applicable for your final project, you can copy and paste text directly. The idea was that you've gotten some background research. You've formulated a question that might be able to be used for your final project. If it's applicable, copy and paste directly. Now, if you have learned something else in the meantime, you should edit that text. If your grader gave you some encouragement and some suggestions, you should take them into account and edit the text. But if something still applies, you can copy and paste. The idea behind the proposal is you've already done some of the work for your final project. So you're encouraged to edit, but you can use pieces directly. Copy and paste does not have to be changed. You are not plagiarizing by doing so. For these sections, I wanted to just note a few things where we saw general patterns. So for both the individual and the group proposals, a question where you just say, are these two things correlated, is a little too simple. And you should have gotten feedback, but we want you to move beyond just like running a core function, just looking to see whether or not two things are correlated. We want you to really understand a topic. So while calculating a correlation may be part of it, how can you formulate the question so that you more deeply understand your topic in question? For background and prior work, general issues were that people didn't include a general introduction to the topic. Envision that this section is after somebody's read your question and they are unfamiliar with your topic, what would they need to know to then understand your analysis? This should include a general introduction to the topic, a summary of what you found by previous researchers or previous analyses, and you should have citations. And it should be clear which sentences from your background come from which references. So you can do that with superscripts or with parentheses specifying the number or the name of the author, as long as that author is also included in your reference below. Anything that links each reference to the sentences that it came from is fine. I don't care about which format you're using, as long as that's clear. For hypothesis, people lost points because they didn't explain their thinking. So we want both what you think the answer to your question is ahead of time, and then what made you think that. What did you learn? What prior background did you have? What in your life experience? Just something that lets me know you thought about what your hypothesis would be beforehand. For ethics and privacy, some groups and some individuals just didn't think deeply enough here. If you think back to me and Stephanie's discussion in the guest lecture, we talked about how there really are ethical implications to every question being asked. And sure, there's a spectrum. Some analyses have much deeper ethical implications, but think about both the consequences of your analysis. Who could be harmed? Who could benefit? How are you going to protect them? What are you going to communicate? And how are you going to do so to make sure your analysis, or to do your best to ensure that it's not used to harm individuals that it shouldn't harm? So consider possible outcomes and consequences of the answering of your question. Okay, the new sections here are the overview. This should include a summary of your project with results. Often people do a great job in 1 or 2 sentences explaining what your question was and what you did, and then they fall short of just a brief sentence of your results. This should be very succinct, but it should be an overview of the whole process. Question, what you did, and your answer. Datasets, now you're moving from ideal to reality. In your individual project, you'll be given a data set. It may not be the ideal data set for your question, and you have to figure out what the discrepancy is. So we had you do this exercise of coming up with what your ideal data set is. So when you have a real data set and it falls short of the ideal data set, you know the limitations of your analysis, of your conclusions, of your interpretations. So in your final project, the data set section will be a summary of the data you're working with in your project. And anywhere that differs from what your ideal data set was, you should specify that in your limitations when you're doing your discussion. Your data cleaning section should include the code needed to clean the data. If your data set is already clean, this should include the code you ran to test and verify that your data are in the format you need and that you can use them. And how you know, right? Like what you decided and what you looked at to determine that it was in the, say, tidy data format you need for analysis. For data visualization, you can have visualizations throughout, both in your data cleaning and in your data analysis and your results. This is a final report. This is an explanatory report. So these should be visualizations that go beyond just the first one made by default. It should be made clear using what we've talked about throughout the quarter. Your color should make sense. Everything should be labeled. The text should be big enough. It should have a title explaining what you want the viewer to take away. This is a process that takes longer than you think. So give yourself time to spend making these strong visualizations that convey your point easily to the viewer. The viewer should not have to work hard to figure out what is being plotted and what they should be learning from your visualization. Then the data analysis and results. This is where a lot of the work is going to be spent. If you're doing a group project, you'll likely have a few different analyses. If you're doing an individual project, you might just have one analysis, and that's fine. And just as a note, especially for group projects, this may require you to approach something deeper than what we did in class. And you'll be given credit if you try something out, if you take an analysis and go deeper or take a different direction than what we've done in class. Even if you don't get it all the way right, we encourage you to try something new, learn something beyond what was presented in class. Linear regression is not the be-all, end-all. It may be appropriate for some projects, but it's not appropriate for all. So especially for final group projects, challenge yourself to take an approach and learn something a little deeper than what was presented in class. For conclusion and discussion, this should be a summary, it should be clear, and it must discuss the limitations of your analysis. This may be data limitations, bias in your data, where your data set differs from your ideal data set, limitations to the analysis and interpretation. This is the place for all of that. And then for team contributions, that's just a brief description for group projects. The last thing I wanted to talk about here was naming. Your file, if you are submitting a group submission, should have the file name final project, where the F and the P are capitalized, underscore, and then lowercase group, and then XXX, where those XXX are replaced by your group number. So if you were group 10, that would be 010, and that should be a Jupyter notebook. This should be submitted in your group's repository. Same process as submitting the project proposal, but your final project should have a file name that fits those conventions. Do your very best to follow them. It saves us a lot of time in grading, not having to track it down. For individual projects, the process is the same as for the proposal. You will submit a PR to the individual underscore FA20 repo. Please submit the PR to the correct repository. Your final project name should have the file name final project, again, capital F, capital P, underscore, and then your GitHub username should follow the underscore. And again, this should be a Jupyter notebook. So for example, my GitHub username is Shan Ellis. So my file would be final project underscore Shan Ellis.ipy notebook. And note that your final project should be in the you should make a pull request to the final project directory on the individual FA20 repo. If there are any questions, feel free to post them to Piazza, but that's the general procedure. Also, it is now week 9. If you are doing the group project, you should have a data set, or all of your data sets at this point. You should have wrangled them. They should be in the format you need. You should have carried out EDA. Should have started analysis. Note that a lot of people do wait for their analysis until week 10 or the final projects week. I encourage you to start early to hammer out any issues that may arise. You should have some visualizations that are quite strong. Everything's labeled, consistent coloring across them, and your point is very clear. And you should know for sure at this point if the question you want to answer can be answered with the data that you have. All right, good luck as you finish up. We are coming into the end of the quarter. I know it is busy for you all, but I'm excited to see what you all do for your projects.